In this live stream, we're going to be talking about the Jussie Smollett case and with his arrest, and if it's going to impact the ability for people to put legitimate cases forward for believability in their in every time that there is a hate crime because of this hoax. Now, what ends up going through the news cycle every time there is one of these hoaxes is they say if someone is prosecuted for one of these hoaxes, that it will eliminate the ability for them to for people to put up legitimate cases. And every time that there is a hate crime hoax, and it's going to for the legitimate people, is they're going to be scared of going forward with all of this stuff. But frankly, when we look at the actual facts of it, is exactly the complete opposite. When we see these hoaxes come through, it doesn't matter from what community, from blacks, Latinos, Asians, Muslims, Jews. Doesn't matter what group is coming forward with these fake hate crime hoaxes. Uh, it has always the negative impact. I mean, we've seen it throughout the whole thing with it. This is why we're seeing the so-called rise in hate crimes. Well, the reason why this so-called rise in these reports is because these are including falsified reports, and that's why we're seeing these rise numbers with it. So when you see Ben Shapiro come out and say, "Oh, there's a huge rise in anti-Semitic hate crimes," well, that includes a lot of falsified ones as well, which he's not being totally honest with you. So Ben Shapiro can come out and say this all he wants, but he's not being completely honest with you. That includes a lot of falsified reports from Jews that are falsifying reports as well. All of these groups are doing a lot of falsified reports because they know that they can get attention. And this is basically what they're doing, is we're seeing a lot of groups that are doing this solely for attention. And that's where all of this comes from. And they know that it's essentially that there's going to be no punishment for it. They're going to say, "Oh, we're just going to let this slide." Because they're going to say, X party cannot financially afford the cost that it was to the city to reimburse, so we're going to let it slide. And they're not even going to go with the criminal punishment, because they're going to say, "Oh, let's let bygones be bygones," because it'll scare off legitimate claims because of this backward thinking. And that's what needs to be understood, is that doesn't scare off those legitimate claims. That makes those other legitimate claims be doubted a lot more, because when we see these false claims come through, it makes people go, "Well, why am I supposed to believe this claim when all these other claims coming through are completely false and just being done for attention?" Because people are basically in this mode of who's the biggest victim. And we've seen a point to where, especially on the left, where victimhood is being listed as a mode of strength. So the basic figure is, let me fake this hate crime, and I can actually create this whole big thing of where we can create this whole big mentality of victimhood, because we can view that as strength, and we get all this press that they feel sorry for us, and this whole big national press, and it comes out like that instead of actually a legitimate hate crime that is actually legitimate. Now, when it comes to hate crimes, to me, with it, I think it's pointless, because if something because a violent crime to begin with is adding something else on that to me is illegitimate. A violent crime is a violent crime, and that's just my personal opinion on the legal matter. And trying to add something on it is kind of illegitimate. If you're gonna try to kill someone, I mean, there's no point adding saying, "Oh, it's a hate crime." Well, it doesn't matter if you're a white person killing a black person, or a white person trying to kill another white person, or a black person killing a black person, or a black person trying to kill a white person, or so on and so forth. It really doesn't matter if it's racially motivated or not. You're trying to kill another person, and that's homicide. And frankly, it's illegitimate to actually consider it a hate crime because you're trying to kill another person. And it's kind of illegitimate to consider that hate crime on top of it. And it ends up just stirring up more than what needs to be stirred up. But if we're gonna view it as that, then let's view it as that, and let's try to at least grab the actual legitimate cases. Which means if we're gonna view the legitimate cases, let's start. We need to and let the actual legitimate cases come forward. Let's have that. Now, when they say, "Oh, it'll scare off a lot of people," well, the people it's only going to scare off are the hoaxes. And when we start to see these, you're going to start to. There have been websites that have actually shown how many hoaxes there are, and there's actually quite a few. And it actually starts knocking off the majority of these cases. And you'll see about probably at least half, if not a little more than half, of these cases that have been listed as hate crimes are hoaxes. And it's because there's a lot of people out there, especially in this new idea of the left, is when they claim victimhood is a empowerment, is they're basically going to say this is a new way to get victimhood. So they basically do it, and it's victimhood plus press, and that's you're adding two things on top of each other, and that's basically you get to say not only am I marginalized, but see I was actually attacked, and you can fake it. It doesn't even have to be real. You can basically make up a fake group. You're making up a fake target, and you're basically blaming someone else that never did anything wrong. In this case, he was blaming Trump supporters when there was no legitimate case that Trump supporters would have ever even been there. We're talking Chicago. This is with the Smollett case. We're talking Chicago, 88% Democrats. Democrats. Even amongst the other 12%, that was kind of almost evenly split between third party and Republican. And you're talking that's almost impossible. And even amongst that 6% Republican, you're talking maybe one out of every 100 Republicans are, let's say, they're going to be racist. Of what I've seen, maybe one out of every 100 with it that I've noticed. It's usually, obviously, it's a much higher percentage when you get to Democrats because they believe in such things as affirmative action. They believe that blacks are less capable, so they need blacks and other minorities are less capable, so they believe that they need more things because they believe in such things as white privilege. So they believe that they're less capable of basically learning and other different things. So they believe that whites are superior, and they believe whites and Asians are superior. So basically, they believe that Latinos and blacks are inferior races. So this is that is racism. So, but they don't want to claim it as racism, and their idea. That's why they do such things as affirmative action and public aid and different things like that. And they do this deliberately because the fact is they are racist. But So the racism is much higher on the left. Yes, there's people on the left that really don't care, but there's a small percentage of them. But on the whole, with it, those who believe in those policies are racist. And but when it comes to people on the right, it's basically the people who are protectionist, and this very very small percentage. It is closer to 1 maybe 2%. So when we're looking at those percentages in Chicago, take that 6% down to maybe what 0.6, maybe or sorry 0.06, maybe 0.1, which is basically at most you're talking such a small percentage, and or maybe like 0.12% at highest, and these are such a fraction of a percentage that we're talking about. So when we're talking about this, is we're talking basically that's that it would be nearly impossible for that attack to have happened. So when he tries to come up, when people try to come up with, oh, it's still, there's still potentially that he could have not done it. Well, and that there was still it could have happened in the first place. Well, the fact is when we look at the actual facts right there, that's a big negative in the actual point right there. Number two is we had the point of the bleach. Now, his hair was not bleached, number one. Okay, let's just say it didn't hit his hair. Okay, what about his clothes? Clothes were not bleached. That's number two. Number three is the ground. The ground did not have any bleach on that either. That's number three. Now, where's this so-called bleach hitting? And also with the temperature, as well with it, are people really going to be sitting out there just waiting for someone? How do they know that how do they know that someone was going to come out there? I mean, are these people from Chicago? Are these people from, if they're from Chicago with it, as we should assume, they're not just going to be sitting out there waiting, which is kind of stupid, because they could have froze to death, because at those temperatures, especially in late January, which would have led to could have led to hypothermia, depending how long they're waiting out there for someone to basically harass, which is quite stupid. Were these people staying at this place? Why didn't they wait for him? Why didn't they go after him when they saw him walking through the halls? I mean, that was the only legitimate residents around. I mean, these are these questions that need to be asked, and so his story just did not hold water to begin with. And then when it came down to the noose or ligature, or whatever you want to call it, is how was he able to easily break out, and why were they not using like their arms to essentially restrain him? If he's running the opposite direction with it, how is he able to easily break out? Did the ligature break? What happened? Or the noose, or whatever we want to call it, did that break? And that's what needs to be understood, is the fact is this was what his story never contained, is he had a lot of these holes in his story, and that he says these people were uttering both racial and sexual epithets at him. Well, how do they know he was gay? This is the middle of freaking winter. They're gonna be bound up, because obviously they don't want to die, and he's probably going to be the same way. So they're probably not going to they probably can't recognize who he is, and they probably I mean, you really think Trump supporters going to basically say, "Hey, I'm gonna watch Empire on Fox tonight"? Yeah, I doubt it. So these are these big, huge holes in his story that he just didn't even have to begin with, and that this is what didn't even make sense. And then when we see this stuff with it is when you have these huge holes is in your story. This is why the Chicago police are like, come on. I mean, when they start investigating it, like, okay, we're gonna take it at face value. We're gonna start investigating all of these points. Then he starts saying, okay, there's where it happened. There's where the people live. Well, that's where actually his trainer and an extra, his trainer and the trainer's brother lived, which were also extras on the show Empire. Well, they're not MAGA, they're not white MAGA supporters. They're actually black Nigerians, far from white. And you couldn't even, and especially if they grabbed them they were going after him with it, and the way a noose works, they're going to be from behind. How did he tell that they're white? And that's another major factor. You look in the video, you could definitely tell from the closed circuit television, you could tell that these people are black. When we look at the actual evidence in the store, which this stuff was purchased at, you can tell that the individuals were black. And that's why when they came forward, they stated that they were actually financially paid to do this. And they came back stating that essentially the letter in which he forged himself as well. This is why the FBI is investigating him as well. And that he's basically not that's the point is that he's not he was not getting enough reaction from that letter that he mailed to himself. And this is basically, he wanted this whole big reaction, and he wanted to basically pretty much, he has this huge hatred of Trump, and this he wanted this whole big amount of attention, and it was about attention and hatred of Trump, and he wanted to put it together, and it was totally illegitimate from the point go. And when we look at it, that's where the whole stuff comes from, and we need to realize that. And nothing and we have to realize that when we see these things is that those are the 2 points that need to be understood. And you can't just go out there and create these fake things, and then when it comes out to the actual other people that are going to come up with maybe legitimate claims, is that's all it's going to do is hurt those people who want legitimate claims. And legitimate claims are going to be reduced because when we have these legitimate claims are only going to be reduced when we have hoaxes basically filling up the time of the police. So legitimate claims can't have the time to come forward because of that. And that's the only way you're going to have that. But when you start actually fading out these hoaxes, that's when legitimate claims start coming forward. That's one of the major points that need to be understood. Is that hoaxes are the thing that reduce legitimate claims. When the more hoaxes you have, the less legitimate claims you have, and that's one thing that needs to be understood. When you have a hoax, a legitimate, it's going to reduce the amount of legitimate claims, because the fact is especially if that hoax is not being prosecuted. because they know when it comes to the time of the to be going in the whole thing of the public opinion, they know that they're less likely to be believed. But when you start actually prosecuting these people for hoaxes, they know that if their case is a legitimate claim, they know they're more likely to be believed because their case is sound. The sound cases are going to be coming forward more often, and what's going to happen with it is the more legitimate cases are going to be coming forward during those times. Now you're going to have less cases overall because there's not the number of cases that are legitimate, and that's the whole point that we need to understand. So when people say, "Oh, but it's going to not as we're not going to," it's going to hide the number of legitimate cases. Well, it's not hiding the number of legitimate cases. There just isn't the number of legitimate cases to begin with, and that's the whole point. Out there in the world, out there in the U.S. specifically, people just frankly don't care from race to race. They just don't attack people based on sexuality, based on gender, based on whatever factor. Most people just ignore that unless you actually try to force them to do something and try to engage in a fight. Now, if you try to engage in a fight, then there's going to be a situation. Now, what ends up usually bringing up these hate crimes and homicides is the fact is usually gets tabbed on a normal homicide when it could be an illegitimate factor. Most of the things that should be labeled as hate crimes is usually a minority killing a white, but that usually doesn't go on there, or minority attacking a white, but usually doesn't go on there because of the bias of the Civil Rights Division not wanting to essentially discourage minorities from filing claims. Because the fact is, if they start going after and punishing minorities for violent crimes against whites as hate crimes and actually do an actual fair and actually do an even system, there's a lot of people out there who feel that it would essentially discourage it. Well, the fact is it wouldn't, and this is where you find where they use a different definition with it, where they say if a let's say if a black attacks a white and starts railing out racial epithets at the white and says, "Oh, you voted for Trump," and blah 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 blah, and starts beating the hell out of him and kills him. Now that's not essential, or even doesn't kill him, just like beats the hell out of him and assaults him and batters the hell out of him. That would essentially not be a hate crime. But if it were the reverse, and it would be a black or a Latino and a white person doing it, they would essentially label it as a hate crime, which is kind of a very very disturbing fact because of how the Civil Rights Division works, because they state that and it's based on this idea where they feel of this terminology of this with what they call systemic racism, or what it calls, where basically feel, oh, whites are in high positions of power, and they use that as well. But the fact is that's completely illegitimate when it comes to these cases. And if we're looking at the fact is we need to have equal treatment of everyone. It doesn't matter what the case is. Violent crime is violent crime, and if we're going to use the term of hate crime, we need to use it equally. Though I think the term of hate crime needs to be stricken from the books because of what the actual point is there's usually a malice to begin with based on some type of hate, that would actually cause as the motivation, because a hate crime would actually be classified as a motivation, and you cannot basically, number one is it's hard to classify as a motivation, but motivation is not an actual crime. It's there's you can't basically say that a motivation to do a crime is an actual crime in itself. Just as what it called just the actual thought to do a crime. I mean, if you just the idea of such as an idea of if a white hates blacks with it, is that a crime? No, that would technically not label as a crime. If a what it called if one person murders another one, it is a crime with it. But so and that's why what we're doing is we're separating the two things out. Well, we're separating motive from actual crime, and when we separate those two things out, we see that one is crime, one is not. That's why when I look at these things, that's why I judge things of hate crimes really kind of being useless. But if we're going to use it, I mean, first of all, it needs to be used equally, number one. And number two is we need to actually prosecute people if they're going to be using it illegitimately. To me, I say just get rid of the whole thing together, and people aren't going to be abusing the system at all, because the fact is, if it's not there, they can't use it. Because the fact is the idea of these race-based crimes with it, we're just basically going to list them as crimes, and they can't. And then he would have to basically say a crime existed, and it wouldn't have gotten any national attention. He would have basically just tried to bring up some political ploy, and people would have more brushed that off. He would just it would have just been reported as a guy attacked him. They wouldn't have reported any reporting of any race would have been erroneous reporting, because it would have been illegitimate to the case, and it wouldn't have even made any sense to the case, and any other factor would have basically been illegitimate to the points, and when the actual whole thing came out, it would have been shown as being completely illegitimate from the end, and it would show there would have just been a political hoax from Smollett when we look at that case. But if we get rid of these ideas of these hate crime things with it, we'll see the fact is that we're not going to see these hoaxes, because what's happening is too many people are just abusing the system, and it's not worth keeping the system around for the point of people abusing it. And people should just use the regular criminal justice system if they have a problem, because it's just being abused, and there's no other purpose to actually keep the whole idea of it open. I mean, there's other things within civil rights that we can use, but when it comes to hate crimes, just shut it down, because there's no legitimate purpose of it anymore. Because what's happening nowadays is because of all these fake cases that we see popping up all the time, because people view victimhood as empowerment. We're seeing people do these fake crimes all the time, and it's just getting overboard, because the fact is there isn't the hatred that there once was. People just don't care anymore. I mean, the KKK isn't a force anymore. Neo-Nazis aren't a force anymore. The only real force out there with it is for violence is coming from the left, and they're assaulting people on the right, and they're being basically encouraged by the media. So the media is actually the driving force of hate, and it's basically done politically. And we're seeing this political hate being driven by the media itself, and if they would actually report things kindly as fact. And when I talk about media, I'm talking about the legacy media. And if we get rid of these points of these so-called facts, we would actually see the point that it's not about it's not actually about it's just basically about a political agenda. It's not about actually getting to these facts, and they're basically just abusing the system. And you're not actually because it's actually getting to the point to where all these fake cases are going to scare off legitimate cases anyway. And if you get rid of these other one, and if you get rid of the actual system for hate crimes, you're going to basically just be forcing people to pursue it as criminal cases. And what that's going to do is that's going to scare these hoaxes from actually processing it itself. And you're going to get to the point to where the only people who are going to be willing to process it as an actual legitimate case is the actual people themselves who are legitimate cases, because when you are processing it solely as a criminal case itself, is I think you're going to see that you're going to see only legitimate cases doing that, because when they see I'm not processing it under this bulk label of hate crime, I'm processing it under just straight criminal code, is you're going to see the fact is it's going to change, because you're not going to find people that are going to be bold enough to do this, because they're going to see the fact is that it's going to be a lot different when it comes down to it. And if we start regularly prosecuting these people who are perpetrating these hoaxes, you're going to see these hoaxes drop down a lot. And you're going to see the fact is there's just not the amount of hate that out there that people want it to be. And most of the hate's coming from the left, and we see this. And it just doesn't exist. People on the right and people outside of the right left spectrum with it just don't care. I mean, that's people. People just don't care, and that's a fact. As long as you don't engage in force, they just really don't care. They're not going to be out there trying to say, hey, let me beat up a gay black guy in 2 in the morning. No, they're not going to be doing that. Especially in Chicago. They're not going to be trying to freeze himself to death. There's a little thing called self-interest. Self-interest says, I'm not going to die to do this stupid little stunt. And you think you think if you'd be doing that, you think you'd be making a video of you trying to beat up someone. You think you maybe want to do something like that if you're gonna pull some type of political stunt like that. No, you do. They didn't do that. They weren't doing some type of political stunt like trying to beat up someone. No, like we've seen with some other people, like doing these little fights in the streets, and you see where they take video of it and post it on YouTube or Twitter or Facebook or any of this other garbage. No. We saw basically that's where we see none of this with it. So all this stuff comes up as like nothing of this happened like that. So it shows that all of this stuff is kind of really, really questionable. And I mean, why would they even be out there that late? I mean, if they're a Trump supporter, shouldn't they be sleeping, getting ready for the next morning for work? I mean, this was essentially a work day anyway, so they're not going to be stupid and miss work and potentially get fired for pulling off some political stunt to harass an actor. I mean, that is the dumbest damn thing in the world. And that's what needs to be understood. Is this is that's why when this case came out, is that was not what was going to happen. And what needs to be understood is when these cases go through, is uh, what's going to happen is you're going to have the whole media jump on and say, oh, they should prosecute him because he might have a legitimate reason why this happened, and he might be telling the truth. Uh, this is what some media is going to be saying. The other media is going to be saying is we shouldn't prosecute this because it's going to limit the people telling the truth. Well, the fact is, it's all garbage. We need to essentially prosecute all the people telling lies because we only want people telling the truth out there. And if you legitimize a whole industry of people lying, that's essentially going to limit the amount of people who are going to be telling the truth. And it's going to basically cause an incentive for it. And because you're saying there is no punishment for lying. And that's why the Chicago police are essentially charging him with a felony, arresting him, and that's why Cook County is charging him with a felony. That's the sole reason of it, because they know that there is a huge negative impact of this, of what happens if they don't, because it'll essentially boil over and we'll see massive problems. And that's what needs to be understood. And that's why they're doing this. There's no negative impact from this. There's just basically, this is to kind of stop these hoax hate crimes. And this is the whole point of what even the Chicago Police Commissioner was stating. And if you look at what they did, they went over with a fine-tooth comb over this whole thing. It was basically, they took his story basically at face value, and then they investigated from that point. Now when you do that, that costs a lot of money to the city. Now we do not know right now at this point what the actual financial cost was, but those resources could have essentially been used elsewhere. What we actually know is that when we look at the ability for the percentage of being able to solve homicides, we know that has been reduced for the last 2 years to a very, very low rate of being able to go from about 3 years ago to about 30%, down to 2 years ago, down to I think it was about I think it was like 18% or something, and down to like about 15% last year. So when we see this, that basically is they're having trouble solving homicides because of the fact of resources being manipulated around, and then the way the actual Emmanuel government has actually done this through basically manipulating resources, and then essentially this moron does this, which essentially takes police resources directly away from the direct investigation of other crimes, which is the initial people that hit those crimes are very, very important. Those are the people that first gather the evidence on these things, and when you have those people gathering evidence and processing it on some stupid hoax crime, that costs a lot of things, and that essentially could lead to several homicides basically being unsolvable because of that. And you say, oh, but those aren't homicide detectives. Yeah, but when you have these beat cops that are basic beat cops, or other people who are out there gathering evidence with it, when those people that are meant to process evidence are basically taken off those areas and are basically moved to process for this other case for a few weeks, guess what happens? That causes a huge problem, and you cannot process for these other cases, and it causes a huge backlog. And basically, if you don't get a serious lead within the first couple of days on these homicides, they pretty much, the person that committed the homicide goes free. It the actual percentage to catch that person goes down by at least 50%. It pretty much has it's pretty much, and if you don't get them by if you don't get a lead within 3 days, pretty much you expect that case pretty much goes cold, and that's pretty much legitimate fact. And when we see this case was pretty much stalled out for was wasted for 3 weeks on this moron who perpetuated a hoax, and we see what it caused. There were essentially, basically, you saw what it caused, and it potentially led to many cases essentially going cold because of this moron, and because they basically were having inability to get other people out there where it needed to, and he essentially caused massive backlog in the actual system, and that's due to his selfishness. So when they say this, so when there's people making those excuses, this is what was coming out of the mouth of Stephanopoulos, saying, "Oh, but those are homicide. That's a totally different division." Well, it's an actual process of how these things actually go about. Homicide only gets there after the fact, and they deal with it after a lot of the evidence has been grabbed, and they deal with it at a later point. But the fact is the evidence needs to be picked up, the evidence needs to be photographed, and they actually need to get the initial points. Well, if they can't get there because they're dealing with it, because these people are dealing with other crimes, and they're processing evidence, and these other people who process evidence are processing another crime, they're backlogged so far that they can't do anything. And that's what this moron did. And when we see, that's why they want to prosecute him, because he showed what damage that to a massive police office he can do. Well, there's also hoaxes being done to smaller offices around the country, from anywhere from these. There's offices that are like from 30,000 to serve 30,000 people, all the way down to offices that can even serve as small as like maybe like 1,200 people, even like down to like 500 people. Well, what about for those offices? Those offices don't have the ability to serve to deal with crimes like that, and they have huge problems when any type of hoax comes up. And you can have hoaxes have come up in a lot of these areas like that, and that will essentially backlog for any type of crime, no matter what type of crime happens. And when you get a hoax happen, that you need to essentially prosecute that to the fullest extent of the law, because that's what happens. And it doesn't matter who it is with it. If it's some girl that's pretending to be kidnapped, or if it's one of these things, but it doesn't matter if it's a hate crime or not. You need to essentially prosecute all of these hoaxes, because you can't have them, because it backlogs the whole police departments, and there's a lot of people that depend on them for their safety in their areas, because there's a lot of areas that are highly dangerous, and especially in certain areas that are actually having unconstitutional gun control that's essentially not even being challenged, and so they have no ability to defend themselves, and they basically have to rely on the police alone, and there's gangs roaming the streets, and that's all they have. So when it comes down to it, they have nothing else, and then you have some person that actually wants to commit a hoax crime, wants to commit one of these hoaxes, and they think that, and you have the media saying, "Oh, they should be let go without any charges." Well, and they say, "Oh, because then the next person that has a real one might not come forward." Well, no, the person who has a real one is going to always come forward, and they're going to be less likely to come forward if there's a hoax because they don't know if they're going to be believed. The only way they're not going to be believed is if we keep having these hoaxes, and the only way to stop the hoax is to prosecute it. You need to prosecute it very, very harshly, which means I think that we need to actually look at the FBI as well, and the FBI needs to really slap them with some serious justice as well. And I think if they one of the things I think Lionel stated specifically, if they start slapping him with some terrorism charges, I think that would really do well. As on top of that, make him serve well over a decade in prison, if not more. See if we can't give him 50 years in prison to make him think of what he did with his crime, ruin his whole life, and people really start thinking about, do I really want to submit this fake hoax of a police report just for attention? And they're gonna say, no, I don't think so. Or this fake letter, do I really want to send it? Yeah, they're not gonna be doing that. And what's gonna happen is you're only gonna get legitimate stuff going through, and that's what we need. We don't need any of this fake things going through. And you're not going to get any reduction in these things because they're not going to be scared of, oh my God. No, if you're telling the truth, you shouldn't be scared. The police are not going to scare you off from you telling the truth. That's not how things go. If you're telling the truth with it, they're going to look through with a fine-tooth comb, and they're going to see everything's legitimate. They're not going to charge you with anything for telling the truth. They're going to be looking through with a fine-tooth comb. Okay, everything seems legit. Okay, let's go forward. The only reason why they charged Smollett with this stuff is because something after they looked through with it, they were looking through everything with the case with it. Something turned up fishy, and that's the whole reason why is when something turns up fishy, is you need to actually prosecute, and that's where these things come from, and that's what needs to be understood. And when we look at that is when we see the things turn up fishy, you need to prosecute people, and you need to understand that when you do this is people can't be let to go free for these hoaxes. These hoaxes are a huge problem out there. I mean, there was a girl not long ago in Wisconsin. There was I don't know how many years ago this was, but she had a fake kidnapping for attention, and they pretty much, for the most part, let her go free with it. And that's another one that you basically, when you do these things, they say, oh, but she was only 15, and well, it doesn't matter. You need to actually prosecute these things and kind of give them a real hard. Harsh punishment, because they shouldn't be allowed to do these things. And because what ends up happening is it costs a lot of money to the area, it takes a lot of resources, and it doesn't matter. They can go, oh, but I was doing it. It doesn't matter if they were doing it for attention or what the reason was. It's a matter of it basically it gives incentive to a lot of other people to do these things, to do these fake crimes. And so a lot of times you could have an innocent person go to jail for a crime that never happened. And most people don't even think about that. I mean, Smollett didn't think about that, probably. He would have probably been glad that a couple of innocent people could have went to prison for that. There could have been easily 2 Trump supporters that actually fit this identity that essentially went to prison for a crime that never happened, and that's what can easily happen on these things. You can get people going to prison for something that never happened in the first place, and that's what needs to be understood. Is that when these hoaxes happen, people can go to prison. And that's something that's serious. And essentially on something like a crime like that, they would have went to prison for a long time. And It could have just been someone who's basically touring through the area. They could have just been walking around with it and just walking around the area with it with MAGA hats with it. Could have been just like a week later, uh, and could have just been fitting what do you call it, fitting some type of general description. Police snag them, and they could have said, "I don't know what you're talking about," and then Smollett could have said, "Those are the guys," and then boom, you send a couple of innocent people to prison for God knows how long, and probably easily 20 years to prison for something like that. Easily 10 to 20 years to prison for something that they never did because he wants to basically keep his stories alive because it's a hoax, and he could have easily have done that just for two random people with MAGA hats just walking by uh, the next day or a week later, and he could have easily stated that walking around with police, and he could have actually found a couple of people, and that's potentially what he was probably looking for when he was probably trying to find someone. With he was probably trying to hope that a couple of people with MAGA hats were walking around, or hoping a couple of white people walking around with some type of Trump thing, or even what it called looked white with it, and he was probably going to try to pin on them, and that's the way things go with it, and essentially you can send innocent people to prison, and when we're talking about criminal justice reform, I mean, is there anything worse than using a hoax on a police report and sending people to prison for something that never even happened to begin with? I mean, that's pathetic. And then saying that, oh, we should send them to prison because it'll reduce the amount of actual reports on these hate crimes. Well, that's not the truth. It's going to reduce these fake things, and we do not want these fake reports out there, because what's going to happen is innocent people are going to be thrown into prison for these things to basically justify it, because what's going to happen is they're going to say, hey, I need to justify this with it, so I'm just going to pin a finger on some innocent person to do this. So I'm going to basically pin it on some innocent person. And that's what's going to happen with these hoaxes. And the fact is that's what Smollett was trying to do. He was trying to pin innocent people for this attention thing. He didn't care that he was going to send innocent people to jail, because of that was his initial thing, was he wanted attention, and he didn't care if innocent people went to jail, because he was a privileged little brat from that's actually done these that's actually lied to police before, and he didn't care if people actually went to jail for his lies. When it came to the DUI, he actually signed his brother's name, so he didn't care who went to jail. He didn't care if his brother went to jail. That should show you where he sits at. And these people like that, they need to actually go to prison for what they've done. And this is why we need to actually prosecute these people. And these people are seriously a drain on society, and they're willing to steal police resources and send innocent people to prison just for their attention, and just so they can not get into trouble. Now, if you like this live stream, like, subscribe, click the bell, share it on social media to your friends and everyone else, and get them to subscribe to me as well. And I will see you guys later with my regular podcast today on the role of the judicial department, or judicial branch, I should say. Bye, everyone.